Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this lunchtime webinar from Farm to Fork. How can we eliminate modern slavery from our food? Thank you all for your time, your attention and your interest in this vital issue this afternoon. Last month, the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner published a landmark report, Be Our Guests, addressing urgent modern slavery risks for temporary migrant workers in regional and rural New South Wales. That report outlined findings that temporary migrant workers in the agricultural, horticulture and meat processing sectors in rural and regional New South Wales face risks of modern slavery, including forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting, and in some cases, human trafficking, servitude, and even sexual servitude. On the 10th of this month, the New South Wales Parliament's Modern Slavery Committee approved and announced a formal inquiry into the issues set out in that report. And so this timely webinar, From Farm to Fork, brings together a diverse range of voices to discuss issues and opportunities in addressing forced labour and other modern slavery risks in regional and rural New South Wales, and to explore opportunities for stronger collaboration between local communities and service providers, local government, and state and federal authorities. My name is Ben Doherty. I'm a journalist on the Guardian newspaper and I'm your MC for this afternoon. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today, each of us, on unceded Aboriginal land. I today am on Gadigal country and I pay my respects to Indigenous people of this country and to all Indigenous Australians joining us today. We have a brilliant and distinguished panel here today, but we want all of you brilliant and distinguished people to be part of it as well. So there is a chat function at the top of your screen if you'd like to make a comment. And also if you'd like to ask about panellists for the end of the session, there is also a Q&A function for questions. It might be an icon at the top of your screen, or you might have to press the 3 buttons where it says more. And please do send through your questions. We're very interested in your feedback today. As well, everybody participating this afternoon should know this webinar is being recorded. Our first speaker this afternoon is the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dr. James Cockayne, a man familiar to many of you, I'm sure. He's been Anti-Slavery Commissioner in New South Wales for 2 years and has had a career that has spanned the world addressing human rights issues from counter-terrorism to modern slavery, which is the subject, of course, of his address today. James, my very precise running sheet says you have exactly 12 minutes. Your time begins now.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks very much, everybody, for taking the time out of your busy day and busy schedule to join us today to talk about this important and pressing topic in the life of rural and regional communities around New South Wales, the vulnerability of temporary migrant workers to modern slavery. This is an issue that came onto my radar very quickly after I took on the role that Ben has just mentioned, the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner position. I took that up about 2 years ago. It's an independent statutory office, and what that means is that I'm appointed by the government, but I report to the Parliament, not to government. I don't have investigative powers per se. I can't, like police, investigate suspected modern slavery in particular cases, but I can look at thematic issues and I have various powers to provide support and assistance to victims of modern slavery. So before I go any further, I wanted to flag for you that if you are aware of potential victims of modern slavery who you think need support and assistance, you can contact our hotline on 1-800-FREEDOM. That's 1-800-37-33-36. We provide support and assistance to people who are at risk of or have suffered modern slavery. And we've been providing a lot of support and assistance over the last year or so to people in rural and regional New South Wales who are temporary migrant workers, who in all too many cases, it appears, have been exposed to modern slavery offences. Now, in this report to Parliament that Ben kindly introduced, we look at the situation of temporary migrant workers in rural and regional New South Wales, and we did that by both talking directly with some of these people who come forward for support and assistance and undertaking well over a dozen visits to rural and regional New South Wales over the course of my time in office. We found that while most temporary migrant workers working in rural and regional New South Wales are having a very productive and constructive experience, there's a small minority who unfortunately are suffering indicators of modern slavery. So we know that there are at least around 58,000 temporary migrant workers, probably many more, depending on how you understand that term, in New South Wales. About 6,000 are on the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, and around 52,000 or so are on the Working Holiday Maker Scheme. So what we've traditionally thought of as working backpackers. But that scheme has shifted somewhat in recent years from mainly involving European backpackers to a much greater presence now of Asian working holiday makers. In addition to those 58,000, however, you also have international students who are temporary migrants and have work rights. You have some skilled temporary workers here on other types of visas, graduates, those on regionally sponsored visas, and undocumented workers, of course, who are also working in rural and regional New South Wales. So in this report to Parliament, what we did was we focused on three industries in particular: agriculture, horticulture, and meat processing, where people were telling me when I travelled around New South Wales, there seemed to be particular concerns. As I said, most of the time these migrants working in these industries are having very positive experiences in the workplace. They're able to generate income that they're then able to send home. That certainly contributes to household and community level development in the countries that they come from. But in some cases, we were seeing clear signs that people were being subjected to treatment that amounted to debt bondage, deceptive recruiting, forced labour, and in some extreme cases, servitude or even sexual servitude. And this treatment really breaks down into four different areas: working conditions, wages and entitlements, accommodation, transport and living conditions, gendered violence and healthcare access, and isolation and social marginalisation. And when temporary migrant workers suffer abuse or maltreatment across these different areas, together they can meet the test for forced labour and other modern slavery offences, the forced labour test being set out in 11 indicators provided by the International Labour Organization. So that's what we used as our benchmark here to assess whether there were signs of modern slavery. Let me just say quickly a little bit about each of those areas. Many temporary migrant workers have a positive experience in the workplace itself, but find that they are having their wages either withheld or they're having charges taken out of those wages at excessive rates, particularly for accommodation, transport, and access to basic services such as a laundry or kitchen facilities. Often when they return home, they also find that they have not received the superannuation entitlements that they're due, or find it extremely difficult to access those superannuation entitlements. Female migrant workers seem to be a particular risk of sexualized harassment and violence. And when they choose to disengage from certain schemes, such as the PALM scheme, they might find that they are not entitled to or not able to access healthcare. And this has particular impacts for pregnant women. I've heard too many stories directly from healthcare providers in parts of New South Wales, and even from police, of temporary migrant worker women showing up at hospital to give birth, having received no antenatal care for their child. It's a really disturbing and problematic trend that we see in small numbers, but there's clearly a trend emerging in parts of rural and regional New South Wales that of course poses a risk to the health and life, not only of the baby and of the mother, but potentially also public health risks in other ways. And the final area in which temporary migrant workers suffer indicators of modern slavery is through isolation and social marginalisation. In some cases, we heard of workers being told that they were not permitted to leave the accommodation provided by their authorised employer. That's obviously problematic, and not only from a human rights perspective, but also from a welfare perspective for the individuals. These individuals are often living and working in very isolated circumstances, and that contributes to their vulnerability. Many of them, as a result, are disengaging from these schemes. And as I said, in particular, palm workers that disengage are more vulnerable to potential exploitation. And we saw signs that there may be, in certain parts of New South Wales, emerging semi-organised trafficking arrangements that seek to prey upon and target those disengaged workers. Now, some of those workers will have disengaged voluntarily, not because they're seeking to leave exploitation, but because they've perhaps been misinformed that they can make more money if they operate informally. And that's another key driver, it appears, of vulnerability to modern slavery. The costs of all of this fall, of course, first and foremost on the migrant workers themselves, but also on the communities that are ending up hosting them and providing them the humanitarian support and assistance that they need. In the Leeton and Griffith area, which we're going to hear more about from our panel today, we were told by local service providers that they long ago ran out of crisis accommodation beds to provide disengaged workers showing up looking for support. And in fact, now at one point they ran out of tents to provide these workers to sleep rough in parks. So there's, in some places where we see large numbers of these workers congregating, there is a little bit of an emerging humanitarian crisis for some of these communities. They're not informed by the federal government before a group of workers arrives to work in a particular area. So that means that there's an increased demand for healthcare, potentially for housing stock. Increasingly, also there's questions of policing that arise, perhaps because isolated, vulnerable, maltreated workers may end up turning to alcohol as a helpmeet, or also relying on petty theft to make ends meet, particularly when they disengage. So local communities are increasingly stepping up and stepping in to fill this gap, but bearing the burden here without the support that they need from state and federal government and from the community more broadly. So in the report, we suggested 5 recommendations to begin to address this. The first of these, I'm very pleased to say, has already been adopted by the Modern Slavery Committee. This was the suggestion that the Modern Slavery Committee, a standing committee in New South Wales Parliament, conduct an inquiry into these issues. And the reason we think that's important, and the reason we welcome the inquiry, is because the committee has investigative powers that I lack. The committee can subpoena people, it can require people to provide information, and it can ensure the confidentiality of those who come forward to provide information. So if you're listening or watching today and you think you might be interested to share your experiences with the committee, please do be in touch with them or be in touch with my office and we can help connect you confidentially to them. You can find more information on their website and they'll be accepting submissions until the end of January. The inquiry will then continue after that. The 4 other recommendations we made were to ensure relevant New South Wales government frontline agencies get suitable training so that they can identify and respond to cases of modern slavery, for the state government to advocate to the federal government around visa settings to ensure that temporary migrant workers have the rights and the mobility they need to be able to protect themselves, that the New South Wales government complement its new Migrant Workers Centre with regional outreach, including migrant centre hubs, so that it's not just a centre based in Sydney, but it's actually on the ground providing migrant workers the support they need where they need it. And finally, to ensure resources and information sharing for non-government stakeholders, including local councils, government stakeholder in that case, to ensure they're able to play a more active role in preventing modern slavery and monitoring and monitoring the working and living conditions of temporary migrant workers while they're there in the community. So this was the central thrust of our report recently published. I greatly look forward to the conversation from the panel and from all of your questions, comments and input today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview, that comprehensive overview, James. We're really grateful to you for that. I'd like to introduce now our panel. I'm going to run through our guests and then go to them for questions before opening up the floor for broader questions for everybody on the webinar this afternoon. A reminder for that comment and that Q&A functions that we have Biba Honnet is the manager of North Coast Settlement Service, St Vincent de Paul, New South Wales. Sanmati Verma is the legal director of the Human Rights Law Centre. Stephen Ronson is executive director of enforcement at the Fair Work Ombudsman. Tony Reneker is the former mayor of Leeton Shire Council and is the chair of the Mayoral Alliance for the Pacific. And Mabel Wong is Group Ethical Sourcing Manager for the Coles Group. We'll go to those panellists in order. Biba, can I start with you? You are on the front lines of seeing this, seeing palm workers, seeing disengaged workers, seeing undocumented workers. What are the challenges that you face as a community service provider in responding to the needs of temporary migrant workers in your area? What's being done for people now and what needs to change to improve that?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think the biggest challenge for us is doing work that falls outside of our remit, work that we're not funded for. This is true for my settlement service and for many others that include health and legal that I'm in contact with. So temporary migrant workers usually present to my service with really simple welfare requests. It might be a need for warmer clothing or maybe some blankets or a, can you help me? I have a fine. What does it mean? Type situation. And it's really hard for us to not help with something that's a small thing. It's easy for us to make a quick referral. But once we gain a little bit of trust, we hear about issues with unsafe or overpriced accommodation, or they raise issues about their working conditions or their rates of pay or costs for transport. Or they say their movement is restricted during their non-work time, or their supervisor has threatened to deport them if they complain again, or they say that they're too afraid to complain in the first place because they might lose their employment and have to go home. And we're also seeing workers who have disengaged from the PALM program for many of the above reasons. And these are the hardest for us to refer because many agencies and services that we work really closely with have got to turn their backs. What I hear often from various departments is about how we can mitigate risk to the community from temporary migrant workers. But I'm part of a group that's been trying to engage palm workers in the Northern Rivers since the beginning of this year. And we wonder if it's actually that they are being protected from us. We keep being blocked, even though we know where they live and work, and nobody seems to want to bring temporary migrant workers into the community. We all are sort of starting to feel like we are operating in the dark where these workers are concerned. From my conversations with many workers, both engaged and disengaged in Palm, I believe that we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg of worker unhappiness. On top of their working and living conditions not being what I would accept for myself or anyone that I care about, they're also telling me that they feel really isolated. I've seen positive changes in their outlooks. Say a worker that we introduced to a local church community, she started going to church every Sunday, and she has completely her view of Australia is now a positive one. Yesterday, a community member said that she picked up a group of workers from her country and she took them to the Big Banana. They spent the day on a water slide. And it was not only the first water slide this group had ever experienced, it was also the first time they'd done anything recreational outside of their accommodation during their stay in Australia. I was recently asked to help a group learn first aid because their accommodation is so remote and they worry about things like snake bites. And the community member who is helping them is also worried about how these workers would fare in a bushfire. Would they even receive or understand a warning to evacuate? So I think I'm focusing on this at the moment. I think people as coming to Australia to work need to be included in our communities. There are so many of us, service providers and community groups and individuals, who are already doing the work of welcoming new arrivals and preparing them for life in regional Australia. And where temporary migrant workers are concerned, we need to be working with them and reaching them before they end up presenting to us in crisis or after they've disengaged. Because once they disengage, their vulnerability is so much more, so much increased.
Can I ask about one point there, Biba? You mentioned that often the initial contact you have is people coming to you with really simple stuff. I don't have enough warm clothes. I need a jacket. I need more blankets or something like that. But it's not until your second or third engagement that you're hearing about these more difficult, these more intractable problems about working conditions. And I imagine that makes it a lot harder, given people's reticence to come forward and make those complaints, to actually get a clear and a comprehensive picture of the situations that people are facing.
It is. It takes time. Sometimes it takes a number of engagements before they, for example, invite me to their accommodation to talk further, and then a whole group will have a host of questions about their rights and about who they can ask for advice on different issues. Yeah.
Thank you, Biba. That's a really fascinating reflection from sort of where the rubber meets the road in this issue. Another group that is sort of at the coalface of working here are local councils. Can I ask you, Tony Reneker, what's the role of local councils in addressing the potential exploitation of temporary migrant workers in New South Wales? And what was the genesis, the rationale, I suppose, that led you to establish this Mayoral Alliance for the Pacific?
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. It's a funny one. The role of the local council officially is just to welcome the workers to the local government area. Now, ironically, we don't get notified that we're getting these workers come to town, so we don't welcome them, which is, again, seems crazy. But as you said, we are the local government, really are the have our eyes and ears on the ground, and we hear of the unscrupulous labour hire companies. We see the below standard living conditions, and we see social issues appearing on our streets. So, in my mind, there is a real role to be played by local government. Unfortunately, like any government body or organisation, our resources are pretty finite. We just don't have the resources to be proactive in addressing some of those issues. As a result, some of our local community groups take up the baton there, and people are volunteering their times trying to solve some of the problems, which in my mind are problems that should be solved at a state and federal level. We've been very frustrated, being a small shire here. We saw these problems. Nobody was really listening to us. So when we read the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's report, there was a fair bit of high-fiving going on down here, because it was, finally it was getting out there what the situation was at a local level. Lots of frustration in that, which sort of led, I suppose, to the formation of the Mayoral Alliance. Of course, we have our own networks. I spoke to the Mayor of Griffith City. Doug Curran spoke to Dallas Tout, the Mayor of Wonga, and they were experiencing the same types of issues that we were as well. And so we formed just a little Western Riverina Alliance. And from that, it just grew. We partnered with welcoming cities, and as it turned out, the issues we faced were nationwide, particularly in Queensland. Queensland have more farm workers than we do in New South Wales, but certainly New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and Western Australia all have the same types of issues. All the issues that both Biba and the Commissioner raised, we've seen firsthand here. We've seen people living in tents, and we've seen the overcrowding. We've seen the disengaged workers. The disengaged workers come to our shire because they know that they'll be accepted here, and also there is work available. And that's one very important point. Our local industry and farmers and agriculture are reliant on these farm workers. So they come here disengaged from the visa system, and they get paid cash money, which is fine, but they don't have any types of help, or that they lose their benefits such as Medicare. So we have people who get injured, who are disengaged. A disengaged worker gets injured and goes to hospital, and suddenly they won't see him because he hasn't got a Medicare card, or he's got to foot the bill himself. So some real issues occurring there. The Mayoral Alliance has been successful, and again, it's sort of the timing of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's report was wonderful, and we now have a meeting on the 20th of November in Canberra with the Minister to discuss some of the issues. What I found is that the workers themselves aren't confident to engage the system to say that it's not working. So whilst if you read the documents, there's checks and balances in place, reality is the workers aren't confident enough to engage that. And so there's a real issue there. Again, the Mayoral Alliance is, I think, has been a real, it's unified our voices. Instead of being one little Shire talking to someone, we've got this whole alliance now of mayors working. So we're hoping that as an outcome that we get, the local government or the local community groups somehow better resource to address the issues. But we need to be proactive, not reactive to something. And I think if there's if we can identify issues and we know there's occurring, we should be able to do something about it ourselves.
Tony, you mentioned there the impact on sort of local community groups. I'm thinking church groups, other community groups who are kind of reaching out to sort of help these disengaged workers. I remember a speech a little while ago from James talking about the fact that in Leeton, you literally ran out of tents to be able to provide to people. Can you tell me about the impact that these efforts are kind of having on the community groups that are trying to help, for instance, disengaged palm workers in your part of the world?
Yeah, look, we have a number of community groups trying to help, as you said, and they've been pushed to the limit. There's only a certain amount of tents to go around, only a certain amount of accommodation, only a certain amount of health issues that we can tend to. All the groups and organisations are really aware of the impact and the issues, and are all trying to address it in their own individual way. But there needs to be a concerted effort from a government-funded body to address some of these issues. As I said, and I'll just say again, we're big supporters of the palm system, and when it works well, we've got some great employees in town here, and the palm workers are looked after, and it works really well. But when they're not, there's problems, and as the Commissioner said, particularly around disengaged workers, there's some real issues for us in town here. We've seen the evidence of alcohol abuse, increase in domestic violence, increase in traffic offences occurring through alcohol, and that's the sort of stuff that we want to address.
Thank you very much for that perspective, Tony. We're almost grateful to you for that. Can I move on to Stephen Ronson from the FWO, the Fair Work Ombudsman? Stephen, can I ask, since the FWO's investigations into poultry farms, which I think was 2015, and horticulture, which was 2018, there are continuing allegations of labour exploitation and of practices akin to modern slavery. What's being done to protect vulnerable workers like palm workers in these sectors?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ben. And just hello to everyone, and thank you to the office for the invitation to present. The Fair Work Ombudsman is the national workplace regulator, and with respect to palm, we work very closely with the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And we do a lot of things behind the scenes, if you like, to ensure the integrity of the palm scheme and to minimise any instances of exploitation. So, for example, we conduct all workplace compliance history checks, we provide technical advice, we develop education resources, we provide on-arrival briefings, we refer any suspected instances of human trafficking and or modern slavery to the Australian Federal Police, and we participate in the palm disengagement interdepartmental task force. Just over the last 5 years, Ben, we've commenced 228 investigations into approved employers in the scheme. We've recovered around $750,000 for just under 2,000 workers. And in the process, we've issued around 52 compliance notices, 11 infringement notices. So we are, if you like, the police force in the palm scheme. Recently, though, every now and again, we have to commence legal proceedings. And last month, we filed a case in the Federal Circuit Court in Brisbane, where we are making a series of allegations against an approved employer called McChrystal Agriculture Services Proprietary Limited. We're also suing its director, Mr. Russell McChrystal, and we are alleging impermissible deductions under the Fair Work Act. And I just want to raise this case because it goes to some of the key elements and some of the points that have been raised by others already in this webinar, which effectively is the issues that arise through reliance and remoteness. So this particular company It basically operates a registered labour hire business and a sweet potato farm near Bundaberg in Queensland. As I say, it's an approved employer under the scheme. The employees in question are from Vanuatu. They're in Australia for a limited period of time, and they're highly reliant on their employer for their work, their pay, their care, their accommodation. And so these workers are spending each day cutting and sorting sweet potato vine into bundles. They're planting, they're packing, they're weeding, they're doing farmhand tasks. Now, in this matter, we've taken this company to court because we're alleging that they put in place a policy to fine employees $500 for breaches of the company's alcohol policy. They put this policy in place, which stated in part that there was zero tolerance for workers consuming or being under the influence of alcohol while staying on worksite accommodation. Our case, now filed, discloses that between January and March 22, 29 employees faced fines under the alcohol policy. It totaled $14,500. Most of these impacted employers are living on this worksite accommodation. On some occasions, employers were left with only $150 of pay at the end of the week, recalling that these workers are here to try and get ahead, to send some money back also to family at home. So we're seeking declarations and penalties against this company. Last year also, we secured a penalty from the Federal Circuit Court against another labour hire company operating in the Palm scheme that had underpaid 87 Papua New Guinean, Vanuatu and Solomon Island workers nearly $50,000 in North Queensland. So there's always more work to be done. We work closely with Australian Border Force. As I say, we refer instances of any exploitation that borders on trafficking to the AFP. But I put out the call. We have an anonymous tip-off function, or you can approach us directly. Any instances of exploitation, please let us know, and we'll be taking it very seriously. So thanks for that, Ben.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. That was fantastic to hear about the work you're doing, and also for everybody on the line. As Steve said there, you can approach the FWO. There's an anonymous tip-off line, and they are willing to look into any and all of those allegations and instances. Sanmati, can I ask you about the legal framework? We know that migrant workers are unlikely, I suppose, to report exploitation unless they feel they're going to be protected from deportation and from any potential retaliation from an employer. Is that something that migrant workers, we're talking palm workers, working holiday makers, is that something they can rely on, that they can count on? And how can they be made to feel confident that they'll have those protections?
Thanks very much for that, Ben. So I'm a migration lawyer. That's all I've done for years. I work at the Human Rights Law Centre, but I've also worked for, which is how I've come into contact with farm workers. I've also worked as a migration lawyer for the United Workers Union for years and years. And I suppose I wanted to sort of push back on this idea that we can either sort of simply educate workers out of some of the structural problems that they encounter, or, you know, on the other hand, enforce our way out. I think what we are learning from a migration sort of space is that the key actors in addressing labour exploitation are the workers themselves. So, which comes to your questions about the migration scheme. So there are a series of settings that really prevent migrant workers from coming forward and acting on their rights. So as James has mentioned, we've got three key sort of cohorts of migrant workers who work on our farms. So they're workers from the Pacific engaged under the PALM scheme. You've got working holiday makers who are backpackers now from all around the world. They're not just European as they once were. And then we've got a really significant number of undocumented workers. And when I say undocumented, I mean, you know, and we're not used to thinking about this in the Australian context, but people without visas at all, or people who hold visas that either are subject to a work restriction or prevent them from working generally in the labour market and restrict them to working for only one employer. So viewed from this perspective, PALM scheme workers who are working on farms other than for a PALM scheme employer are undocumented. They're engaging in undocumented work. So there are a series of restrictions that are really specific and a series of factors that are really specific to each group. And the government has taken the current government has taken a series of really commendable steps to address some of those migration-related barriers. The first and most obvious is repealing Section 235 of the Migration Act that made it an offence to engage in undocumented work. Now, that was something that migrant workers and their allies in the union movement had been pointing out for years, was a just sort of anomaly in our migration system, that it is a crime for a worker themselves to engage in work when they're irrespective of the conditions they're encountering. And then they've introduced, relatedly, a pilot of protections for temporary migrant workers, and that includes two components. And I see some of my colleagues on the line who are involved in that process. And the first is a protection against a guarantee against visa cancellation, where a worker has been exploited at work, but also breached a work-related condition of their visa. And the second is a dedicated workplace justice visa. So to allow workers to remain in Australia with full unrestricted permission to work while they take action against their employer in relation to exploitation. So these measures all sound very good, and they're ambitious. You know, they really build upon models that exist in, or they expand and take forward models that exist in Canada and also New Zealand. They're really sort of a significant stride forward, but I suppose what we're seeing are limitations. The first is obviously the cancellation guarantee, or the protection, relates only to one specific ground of cancellation under the Migration Act. So where you've breached a work-related condition. But as we all know, we've all, followed media reporting about Novak Djokovic and the expansion of, visa cancellation powers. One ground in many. So what we're seeing now, specific to PALM scheme workers, is where workers have disengaged from the PALM scheme, and the Department of Home Affairs doesn't know that they're working elsewhere. They are nominating a ground for cancellation in notices to workers that is not the subject of the protection, meaning they don't get access to it. So, which is a real problem. And it seems to us like the part of the department responsible for administering the new worker protections is not talking to the cancellation section of the department very well, so that the cultural shift hasn't happened yet. And the second limitation is with the workplace justice visa, it's only open to workers who, number one, currently hold a substantive visa. So undocumented workers, some of the most vulnerable workers subject to some of the worst exploitation, as has been documented in James's report, that visa is not open to them. So that's a serious problem. And then when it comes to PALM scheme workers, the visa is only open to people within the last 28 days of their current visa. So say you're a PALM scheme worker, and one of the reforms that's recently been made to the PALM scheme is to extend visa eligibility to 4 years. So say that you're subject to exploitation in year number 2. You can't simply transition onto another visa that would allow you a little bit of breathing room and space while you sought advice or took action in relation to your employer. You have to find simply another way to remain on the same scheme. A really huge issue that needs to be addressed for PALM workers is the specific way that they're bonded to particular employers. So much more tightly, because of reforms that have been made to the employer nominated skilled visas that exist, PALM scheme workers still remain tightly bonded to an approved employer. And if they disengage, this is what we're talking about, disengaged workers, if they disengage from work for that employer, they end up facing a cancellation process pretty quickly. And the process of being reassigned to another approved employer can be restricted in a number of ways. First, depending on the industry, there might only be a couple of approved employers. So if you've got a problem with one, you might really struggle to be placed with another one. And another issue is that it's not something that you can independently do. You can't go and independently approach an approved employer and say, will you take me on? Do you have a job for me? That has to be brokered by the Department of Employment and Education Workplace Relations. It has to be signed off by various parties. It's a cumbersome process. And what we see is that visa cancellation intervenes to sort of short circuit it and prevent people from really acting on their rights. So mobility, addressing the specific needs of undocumented workers, these are remaining pieces for reform that really need to be addressed if we're going to address these obvious migration-related barriers that are built into our system and that render workers really vulnerable when they come to work.
Sanmati, thanks for that. Look, we're running short of time, but I just want to ask you one little thing about that. Around the 28 days, that really tight time frame, either the 28 days before the end of their substantive visa or 28 days after it's expired. What's the rationale behind that? Because that is a very tight timeline. Either people have got to kind of hang on this visa until they get to within the last month, or they've got to get themselves organised really quickly at the end of their visa to be able to lodge for this workplace justice visa. What's the rationale behind imposing that timeline and such a short time limit?
That's a really good question. And I'll be really interested to hear during the comments some of my colleagues who were involved in the co-design process. But so far as we understand it, the government and the Department of Home Affairs, this is a big paradigm shift. These protections are a big paradigm shift, which is really commendable from an enforcement-based approach and a kind of stick-based approach to some of these issues to a more carrot-based approach where workers are actually incentivized to come forward. And what was a real concern is ensuring that the workplace justice visa was genuinely a visa of last resort. And so the 28-day paradigm, it's exactly the same visa that was extended to workers during COVID. So the same COVID visa that we heard a lot about during the lockdown period, the same subclass of visa has been extended, and that was the way that that visa operated. So seriously, a last resort, you've got nothing else going for you sort of visa. But it creates its own perverse sort of problems, which we pointed out in the co-design process, which is, do you incentivize workers to hang around in an exploitative workplace until that last 28 days so they've got the fresh evidence of it? So these are some of the settings that we hope during the pilot can really be addressed.
Thank you very much for that, Sanmati. Mabel Wong has been waiting very, very patiently there. Can I ask Mabel Wong from Coles, what can retailers at the end of the supply chain, retailers like Coles, do to detect and to remedy possible modern slavery offences that are occurring in supply chains?
Thanks very much, Ben. And then also a huge thanks to the office for inviting me to share alongside this expert panel. And I think perhaps, the rest of the panel would know, human rights harm, such as modern slavery, they don't usually happen in isolation. Modern slavery, would be closely linked, could be closely linked to other types of harm, such as discrimination, other forms of abuse, lack of access to effective grievance mechanisms. And a lot of times these are often interconnected and then have also underlying systemic root causes. At the same time, a retail supply chain, complex, multi-tiered. It's not only the products and the fresh produce a lot of customers come into our stores for, but obviously we also have thousands of suppliers who provide us goods and services that support our operations. With this, then we know that for a retailer, our modern slavery risk profile, it's not static, right? It changes over time as we enter into new areas of business, engage with different suppliers, or suppliers engage with different suppliers or engage with different labor hire firms. That the risk profile can also be impacted by our buying strategies, impacts where we source materials, services, goods from. So really, Ben, set against this background, we really have to take, and we do take, a risk-informed approach. The size and the nature of a retail supply chain really makes it impractical to be directly monitoring compliance of every supplier in our extended supply chain. So we understand, we have to therefore understand where is the most severe harm that can take place in our value chain, in our operations. And then I think also importantly, how does that harm present itself in a retail context? And so then with that, we have to look to implement solutions around remediation where honestly, as a retailer, we will have the most leverage to effect longer term sustained positive change. And sort of describing that, really then this forms, for us, the building blocks of our ethical sourcing program, which obviously commonly heard, policy, supplier requirements, controls, reporting. This is important to us because it gives us a consistent framework, strong governance, then that lets us us to continually assess, continually detect modern slavery risks in our supply chain. It also lets us have a framework that we can consistently evaluate our in-scope suppliers' practices, really enabling us to work in a consistent manner with suppliers to remediate findings, really ultimately for safer and fairer workplaces for workers. So, but other than, I guess, the program, there are really other avenues. It's not just one to detect modern slavery risks. And really, it's through having different grievance channels, Ben. At Coles, concerns around worker well-being in our supply chain, they can really come through a multitude of sources. We have our stop line. It's not just that. There's also direct reporting through team members, suppliers, share that with us. We also partner really closely with unions or we do site visits and we observe particular areas. Then we also hold regular worker outreach education events in hotspot areas across regional Australia, really to provide workers with a safe space to raise their concerns. Obviously, it's important the work of what the office is doing, but we also obviously keep abreast of what's happening elsewhere through news, engage with civil society to, I think, ultimately to understand, how these modern slavery risks could be present in our supply chain, and really involves kind of like review of our data systems, engaging with suppliers, engaging with our commercial teams, engaging with procurement, etc. When there is a legitimate concern or issue raised, Ben, through that multitude of grievance mechanisms I just described, or identified as a result of some of the third-party audits that we do, we will absolutely seek to work with our suppliers, unions, worker representative bodies, or other relevant stakeholders to better understand the issue, and then obviously to ensure that appropriate remedy is provided. We have to set expectations, a lot of follow-up, and also support capability building for our suppliers to support in remedying human rights harm. And really through that process, not easy, but something we absolutely focus on, has resulted in improved working conditions, including repayments, for workers. I think all the areas that I describe to effectively detect, remediate, Ben, it's not a one-off exercise. Really, it's ongoing review, ongoing monitoring, regular internal, external communications, extensive follow-up. Also, sometimes we don't get it right, and then there'll be course correction. We also need to establish protocols for remediation. So really that process to detect and remediate in the context of retail, and to be honest, for many others as well, it really is a cycle of continuous improvement. Ben.
Thank you for that, Mabel. I'm really interested to hear about the worker outreach program you do. You go out, you ask workers and those sort of things. One of the things we heard earlier from Biba was that often initially, in particular, workers are sort of reluctant to raise significant sort of systemic issues. Is that something that you found, and how do you get past that? How do you get people to sort of to disclose these things when, as we previously discussed with a number of our panelists, people feel that their visa, their right to stay in Australia, their right to work is potentially in jeopardy?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben, for that question. Doing the worker outreach events is not a new thing. We've been doing it for years, and it's not done alone. We partner with unions to do these worker outreach events, and really in partnership with the unions who have established a lot of trust from the workers. It's not like us showing up at the event and then expect them to speak, but they've seen the local union reps and have spoken to them and have engaged on issues, and then in partnership really asked with the union to then be able to have such an outreach event. They would already know and trust the union, and then be able to sort of share the issues. Ben, also like at these events, it's also the union sharing what the workers' rights are, what their entitlements are, what their pay should be, what accommodation should look like, what deductions should look like. So it starts off more first with giving information on what workers' rights are, and then through that opening up for workers to be asking questions based on what information is shared. And I think with us then going back again and in partnership, that's where then we're able to hear, from workers who share. I think also just to end off the following up and remedy is not that enough to therefore just hear. If there was, an issue that is raised, and obviously in partnership, we will be seeking to understand and investigate as well.
Thank you very much for that, Mabel. My timekeeping hasn't been brilliant this afternoon. I apologise to everybody online, but we're going to open up to questions, and we'll try to get to as many of these. So I'm going to throw these open to the entire panel. Whoever would like to answer, please jump in. Madeline Rossiter asks, we see women who come to Australia on the PALM program then experience domestic violence, who may also be pregnant or have young children, who are then unable to work due to childcare, being heavily pregnant, and then their partner disengages from the PALM program. This woman is often left living in poverty with no income, unable to work, to receive medical care or place their children in childcare. What strategies are in place to combat a very, very serious situation like that? James, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Look, I'm going to be a bit provocative and say there aren't strategies in place, and that's a key part of the problem. Many of these schemes are designed for how they work when they're successful, and there are certain safety nets in place, but as Sanmati was explaining in great eloquent technical detail, they're not actually working. The reality is that most temporary migrant workers are very reluctant to come forward and talk about the problems they're having. That might be because they fear retaliation against them or against their family members at home. Perhaps they've incurred a debt to get here in the first place. They may feel a sense of moral or social debt to supporters that help finance their travel here. So we really need to work hard to listen to workers to understand what will make them comfortable to speak up. That goes to visa settings, as Sanmati was talking about, but it also goes to some really practical things like making sure people have access to interpreters of the right gender and the right language so that they can feel comfortable to share their story. At the moment, 25% of palm workers are from Vanuatu in New South Wales. If you're a female Vanuatu worker being sexually harassed in or around your workplace, you don't have access to a female Bislama, which is the major Vanuatu dialect interpreter through the nationally provided service. Some really basic, not expensive things like that. And that goes to the fact that we don't have a strategy that's designed adequately to address the minority of cases where people are not having a good time under these schemes. The reason we chose the language "Be Our Guests" for our title is that we haven't had a national conversation about the fact that we have shifted in the last 20 or 30 years from permanent migration, being the dominant focus of our migration, to temporary migration. We have temporary migration at the heart of so many industrial strategies now, but we haven't recognized that we're creating a permanent guest worker community here. And we need to put in place, exactly as Biba was saying at the top of the conversation, arrangements to make these people feel as sufficiently safe in the community to share and solve their problems with us. We need those strategies in place really quite desperately, I would say.
Thank you, James. And yes, to Biba's point about guest workers being made to feel a part of the community, not an addition to it, but a part of the communities where they are living and working when they're in Australia. Laurie Berg, hello Laurie, has 11 thumbs up to his question, so a lot of people want to hear this asked. Laurie asks, it is clear that palm workers and disengaged workers decline to report mistreatment because they are fearful of losing their job and visa, being removed from Australia and or not being invited to return in the future. Do panellists have recommendations on how the PALM scheme can be reconfigured to remove these barriers?
I can give that a go unless other panelists are happy, but hello, Laurie. It feels like a Dorothy Dixer. Laurie's Laurie and Bassina are one of the leading figures in the design of the workplace justice visa and know exactly some of the limitations of the program. The mobility settings need to be urgently addressed within the PALM scheme. The number of, I suppose if you're asking my even broader view, there needs to be a serious question about the number of approved employers that exist within an industry. So say that the government is going to expand mobility such that it's still within the pool of approved employers. You need to have a sufficient number of approved employers ready and approved that workers are able to move between. So say within certain industries where there are literally 2 employers, so your only chance if you have an issue with one is to go to another. That's the entire realm of your freedom of movement as a worker. That's woefully insufficient, and that's going on in particular industries. So the mobility settings, the number of approved employers, the process through which mobility is achieved, having that be worker-led and worker-oriented rather than initiated through DEWA is absolutely critical. So the grievance process that exists through DEWA is lengthy and cumbersome, and if workers go through it alone, they're sort of bound to fail, which is what we've seen, and absolutely critical in my view is taking cancellation off the table. So there is no role, there should be no role in visa cancellation in trying to bring workers. It's a big sort of push now. Various government agencies are attempting to bring workers back into the scheme and bring folks in from the cold because of, reading some of the work that's coming out from James and others about what workers are really going through when they disengage. Threatening people with visa cancellation is not a great way to go about that. And it seems that is what's happening to sort of jumpstart people into action around their circumstances. That's not going to achieve that. What it's going to achieve is to drive people underground. And then, of course, Laurie, as you know better than everybody, clarifying some of the parameters of the workplace justice visa so that really it's available to all temporary workers, irrespective of their qualifying visa or what their circumstances are at the time. If you've been, the entire purpose of the visa at a high level was supposed to be to allow freedom of movement for workers who had been exploited no matter what their circumstances. So those are some of the things that urgently need to happen in Palm, but that's going to involve a lot of heads sort of coming together.
And Ben, if I can just add there, sorry, Ben, just point of reference or context, I suppose. I agree with what Sanmati just said. There needs to be some urgent visa reforms. We've had one instance in 1 week in Leeton, Shire, 300 disengaged workers arrive in town. So you imagine it's just a headache for everybody involved, and you've got, what are we going to do about these people with these disengaged visas? So needs some urgent reforms. I agree, Sanmati.
Thank you both for your answers there. We are running up against time, but we're going to try and get a couple more questions in. Zoe Torrentis, I'm struggling to read that. I think that, forgive me if I've mispronounced your surname there, Zoe. Zoe asks, do we have basic requirements for accommodation and facilities for migrant workers, including access to interpreters, computers, phone lines, and the internet? Are there some sort of basic standards that need to be adhered to?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. So particularly under the PALM, the way this works is that authorised employers, to get authorisation to employ these workers on these visa settings, sign up to a deed. And in that deed are certain commitments. And for example, accommodation is covered there. Accommodation is inspected often by the local council, but the local council isn't really involved in setting up that deed or understanding who the authorised employers are in their local government area. So if there's something goes wrong with the accommodation, at the moment it relies on the bureaucracy in Canberra to enforce those arrangements. The power relationship that's set up in the PALM is between the authorised employer as the provider of all of the welfare and support system for the worker while they're in Australia, and the worker. And you can see how that power relationship works out. It's really an industrial logic that drives this, that the workers are disposable business inputs brought into the country to meet the industrial needs of particular industries. The problem is when that goes wrong, the externalities that are created, the negative costs, they don't fall on the authorised employer, they fall on the worker and they fall on the local community. So for things like accommodation, what we need to do is we need to shift the paradigm so it's not just the federal government in Canberra, the authorised employer talking to each other, but actually involving local actors that have statutory obligations to enforce things like accommodation standards. So that would be local councils, or in other areas, it would be state government agencies. State governments have been completely absent from the design and implementation of these schemes. State governments also don't know how many different workers are coming in and out of their state and what kind of demand that's going to put on their healthcare services. So we need a much more communal approach to designing solutions in this space, and accommodation is a really good place to start. And there's some interesting work underway that some of the retail and NGO organisations are involved in. I see Mabel nodding. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Mabel.
No, yeah, I guess the accommodation work, James, as you know, has been something that we've been working again alongside the union and continue to. Really, our approach is really to understand and support the delivery of a minimum standard for workers' accommodation. And so that work still continues, definitely not doing it alone, not something we can do alone, and definitely in partnership, with the union. And so I guess for whomever, I guess who've got ideas, input into that, obviously, seeking to hear that as well. but definitely piece of work in terms of minimum standard for workers' accommodation.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of those panels that it feels like we could have done with another half hour, another hour to keep asking questions. I apologise to everybody who asked. There are some terrific probing questions that we would have loved to get to, but we have bumped up against 1:30, so forgive me for not being able to get to all of those. There will be a post-webinar survey, the details of which I think will go up on your screens very shortly, that we would ask you to fill out, which would be of great assistance. You can do, there's a one of those Cody things that you can do there. Can I also stress here the opportunity for people to make submissions to the Modern Slavery Committee's inquiry into modern slavery risks faced by temporary migrant workers. That's at the New South Wales, within the New South Wales Parliament. You can find it through the New South Wales Parliament website, or I imagine we will put a link up for that. Submissions for that are open. There it goes. It just went in there. Thank you, Corinne. Submissions are open until January of 2025, but I'm being told here, don't leave it until the last minute. It's like your Christmas shopping, get into it early. So they are accepting submissions. There will be public hearings. There will be a great deal of information. As James mentioned, that inquiry will have a great deal of powers to subpoena people, to call for evidence, and will be a really valuable tool in understanding the scope of the problem and where these issues are and potential reforms and improvements. Can I thank everybody who's attended this afternoon, and can I thank in particular our panellists, James Cockayne, Biba Honnet, Sanmati Verma, Stephen Ronson, Tony Reneker and Mabel Wong. Thank you all very much for your attendance today and your interest. My many thanks to you all, and good afternoon.